Okay, so welcome everybody to this kind of one-off special meeting with Hayley Clatterbuck from University of Wisconsin-Madison, who's kindly joined us here this evening, or this morning for her, dialing in from the West Coast of the States. So yeah, this is kind of a relatively informal meeting under the proviso of talking about a recent article by Hayley, which was published in Studies in History and Philosophy of Biological and Biomedical Sciences. That's Studies in HBS Part C, as you might know it as, which is about Darwin, Hume, Morgan, the Verae Causae of psychology, animal minds, human minds, all sorts of stuff. So I was going to ask Hayley to just kick us off by giving us a brief taste of what's in the article, and then we'll see where the conversation goes.
The first thing I should say about the article is that any virtues the article has are largely due to the editorial guidance of Greg Reddick. So this is one of these cases in which, the paper improved tremendously through the editing process. So I'm extremely grateful to Professor Reddick for his help. So my dissertation, I was interested in sort of looking at one prominent theory of what distinguishes human from animal minds. And it's this sort of vague idea, but you see it everywhere, which is that the ability to have sort of like abstract thought or the ability to theorize is something that explains all of the distinctive human capacities. And so a lot of the dissertation project was trying to sort of make precise what this capacity is that people are all kind of talking around, trying to look at a few of the sort of contemporary theories today that posit such a difference and how to test for it. But as I was doing it, what you keep finding is that lots of work in comparative psychology is really guided by the conflict between Morgan's canon on the one hand and what Greg has called Darwin's canon on the other, right? So a lot of this debate, the form it takes today is almost exactly the form it took back at sort of the dawn of comparative psychology, right around like the turn of the century. So I was kind of going back and dipping into sort of why did Darwin think what he thought and why did C. Lloyd Morgan think what he thought. So for those of you who don't know, Darwin's canon is basically when you see two behaviors in us and another animal, we should explain them via the same mechanism, right? You should give unified explanations. So you should think that what animals are doing, what we are doing is roughly the same. Whereas Morgan thought that when you're trying to explain some animal behavior, you should explain it in terms of the simplest possible mechanism, right? You should favor explanations in terms of like associative learning rather than insight or reflex rather than learning. You should always favor the lowest possible explanation for the behavior. So on the one hand, Darwin's like, we should think that we should bring up animals, what humans are doing, and Morgan tends to think, no, there's a real difference between us and other animals, and we should give lower explanations of animals. So so this paper kind of sprung out of trying to understand why they thought what they thought, and sort of what motivated their methodological principles. And as I wrote the paper, it was interesting to find that they basically, all of their disagreements arise from a deeper disagreement about the philosophy of mind. So Darwin was a committed Humean, so he thought that the mind was basically exactly how Hume described it, that just have powers of association. And Morgan thought that Hume's theory of mind couldn't actually explain some of the stuff that humans do, that in addition to a Humean mind, you have to add something to get human minds. So largely it was just it turned into a more historical project than I thought, but trying to track sort of this disagreement about animal minds coming down to disagreement about, in essence, Hume's philosophy of mind and whether or not that characterizes the human mind or not.
Thanks, that's really helpful. So I guess there's few enough of us here that we can kind of just, I think, jump in when we want to, rather than having to like use a raise hand function or anything like that. So
for sure,
feel free to jump in at any time, people, and just get into it. But yeah, I'm glad that you, just towards the end of what you said there, you said that this turned into more of a historical project than you first thought. Because one of my questions was going to be about what you see, what do you see this article as? Is it a philosophical contribution, to current philosophical debates, which uses history to kind of make a point, or is it, a historical investigation which has some bearings for modern philosophical debate, and which way did it start, and did it migrate from one end to the other? Because I think that certainly in my own experience, I started out with my dissertation plan being a lot more philosophical than it currently is, and it's kind of migrated towards the history end. And I think that it's quite a common thing in a department like Leeds, where HPS is very much the kind of what the kind of ideology of the department is, that you can be doing history and philosophy at the same time, and you can kind of combine them in these different ways, and people do often kind of slide about throughout their PhD program, perhaps. And so I was wondering like how things started for you, and why, if it started out more philosophically, how did it get so historical?
Well, I mean, part of it is just like maybe an answer that some of you all can relate to, which is philosophy is really hard, and so is history, but there is that thrill of historical discovery in a way, right? Where you're like, wow, I have like found the document that shows the person who's going to say it. So like there's something more in some ways like rewarding about some historical research that I think explains just a tiny bit of why I went down that way. But I think in general, a lot of my papers incorporate history into them, right? So I kind of want to, a recent paper, I sort of investigated sort of the origins of the Mendelian debate, right? Sort of in the early 20th century. I think why I care about history with respect to philosophy is the things we're arguing about today are often things that we've been arguing about for the last, 100, 200, 2,000 years, something like that. And I think one interesting thing when we're sort of examining history is to say, what is it that we're really arguing about? Because oftentimes when you examine a debate that's happening right now, it's disguised in terms of what our current sort of conceptual frameworks are, current theories are, right? So you might think, oh, right now the connectionists in cognitive science are having a debate with the representationalists about cognitive science. And you might think that then the debate is about those two particular views. But I think one thing I like to do is sort of trace throughout history, when do you see arguments that are structurally identical to the arguments we're having now? And then that allows you to sort of find commonalities and being like, here's the debate we've been having, with some important differences. I'm talking to historians, so I don't want to essentialize, but if you can find out, right, that the crux of the debate is similar over a really long period of time, I think historical research can really help you identify what's common there, right? So if you're like, well, actually, the debate today in cognitive science is exactly the same debate that Hume and Reid were having, or that Duns Scotus was having with, whatever, then I think it really can help you identify, what is the problem, right? So in some cases, we talk right now in philosophy of mind about the mental supervenience debate and stuff like that. And you're like, is this just the same as the hylomorphism debate? Kinda, right? And so I think sometimes history is helpful for that reason. And so when I was doing the Darwin and Morgan stuff and kind of getting into their work, it was really interesting to see what sort of confusions and complications were really animating them. And as a philosopher, I was so worried I was doing history wrong. I was like, because am I just seeing what I want to see in this like history of ideas kind of way rather than in like material history? So it was sort of gratifying when I got to go back through Darwin's notebooks that he was keeping as he was writing Descent of Man in particular, to see him really very self-consciously, explicitly talking about Hume, right? Where he's saying, like, I'm reading Hume to understand how the mind works, and if that's how the mind works, then us and animals have the same minds. And so it was one of these cases where the history was sort of tailor-made for a philosopher to do that history, which is, you know, what are the actual philosophical views that people here are citing and looking at? So I don't want to say I can do history in general, but there's a particular kind of history that I think we can step into.
Sure. Yeah. Caz.
This might be a quite a basic question, but I was just wondering about kind of what other sources or what sources you're using. So you're saying, you know, you're using obviously Darwin and Morgan's writings explicitly, but then kind of where do you go from there is just kind of what I'm interested in.
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing that as a non-trained historian, right, is a little bit difficult, right? And because I haven't been trained in that methodology to sort of like know where else to look or even what. So let me just tell a quick story. When I was a graduate student at UW, we have a really good history of science department. And one of my best friends was a historian of science working on protoplasm and early microscopes. And it was funny because I would sometimes go to talks in that department, and in Q&A, everybody is exactly who they are. The historians are historians, and the philosophers are philosophers, and whatever. And it would just baffle me, or sometimes a historian would ask a question where I thought, you could lock me in a room for 1,000 years after hearing this talk, and I never would have come up with that question, right, as a possible question to ask. So, you know, he was giving this talk about early microscopes looking inside the cell, and someone asks, like, well, do you think this is related to like the textile culture in Bristol at the time? And I was like, not that it's a dumb question. I was like, what? Like, I never would have made that connection. And so I think that was a little bit of humility in saying, like, the way the historian is trained to think, and finding resources and finding sort of intellectual malus and is not something that I'm very good at, right? Or that I knew where to look. So partially, and this is just kind of general career advice that was really helpful, was knowing that that was a blind spot, submitting the paper to a journal where I was going to be held to account, right? So submit it to a studies in history and philosophy and biology journal. And honestly, having, you know, Greg Raddick be like, you missed some stuff. And I was like, thank you, right? Like, that's why I'm bringing it to this venue, is so someone can tell me you missed some stuff. And so, so one, for example, nice thing that he pointed out was Morgan's reading of Hume is influenced by his teacher Huxley. And if you go read Huxley's biography of Hume, you get probably what Huxley was talking about in Morgan's lectures, right? Like what notes he was taking. Like there was a little bit more of a broadening of like, here's where to look for things. So I guess my short answer is I didn't know where else to look. And if you don't, at a certain point in any project, you hit the limit of what you can find out. You're like, I know this isn't perfect, but I don't know how to make it better. And then you put it out there in the world to the people who will tell you how to make it better. And so that's kind of how I feel about history in general, is if you don't know, send it to the people who do. I don't know.
That's a really important point that actually you don't hear often enough, I think. And so, you know, because there's kind of the assumption that, you know, your supervisors have got it covered, right? They're experts in their field, and they're experienced supervisors, and they are, of course, and they do kind of hold you to account on a lot of these in a lot of these ways that you're mentioning, but ultimately their expertise is also limited in certain ways. And so, yeah, sending your work to anybody who's willing to cast their eye over it can, and particularly if you feel that you're deficient in one particular area, and trying to find somebody who knows stuff about that and saying, what am I missing? That's a really refreshing piece of advice. So yeah.
And you'll see, like, that's my talk on Wednesday is a project that I was a little bit reticent to share because I'm very confused about it right now, and I'm not feeling very confident about it. But I thought, what better opportunity to have, if anyone in the world knows why this is wrong, it's going to be someone in the audience at Leeds. So I was like, well, the how useful a talk is to me and how dialed in and how smart it would make me look are sort of inversely proportional to one another. So at a certain point, right, it's just be willing to just say, I have no idea. You tell me where this is going right or where it's going wrong. Yeah.
And looking forward to the talk on Wednesday. Obviously, Darwin again. Is it an outgrowth of this paper in any way, or is it kind of a separate project, or how do you see them fitting together? And more generally, I guess, how does your historical your historical work on Darwin, how does that fit in with your other philosophical work? And so, yeah, I'm just looking for a bit of a kind of a map of your interest in how that.
Yeah, so this project largely grew out of, so I taught an undergrad seminar I used to be a professor at the University of Rochester in upstate New York in the States. And I was able to co-teach a class on Darwin and religion with Alan Orr, who's this incredible biologist there, who also writes for the New York Review of Books a lot. Famously got in a big public spat with Richard Dawkins that was very entertaining. But anyway, so Alan is this amazing biologist, and we got to teach a class about basically the history of the interaction between science and religion, and the scientific revolution and stuff like that. So it was this amazing class that was a mixture of history and biology and philosophy and stuff like that. So this project largely came out of trying to teach students what Darwin's arguments were against special creationism in the Origin and elsewhere. And I was noticing something kind of interesting, which is we have this kind of canonical understanding of what his arguments are like in the Origin. And then I was really struck by a line in Darwin's autobiography where he sort of explains how he became agnostic, trending on atheist, right? And he says, well, actually, the thing that's convinced me is this argument that I make in my book, Variation Under Domestication. And that argument's very different from any of the ones that he gives in the Origin, really. So I was kind of, at some point, interested in, like, everyone's been focusing on a particular subset of arguments, the panda's thumb kind of arguments and the vestigial organs kind of argument. And those are the ones that we teach in an intro to philosophy class, what, Darwin's arguments against creationism were, whereas Darwin himself seems to be saying, actually, it's this very different argument that's motivating me to ultimately reject creationism and design of all stripes. So that was what kind of got me interested. And and so I think I might have some kind of an answer. We'll see how it works. It's been fun. I haven't done as much historical research as I should. I recently, though, read through all of Darwin's correspondence with Asa Gray on these issues, and it was kind of just pleasant. And this is kind of in general, like, Darwin is just such a pleasant human being that, like, doing historical research on Darwin, unlike R.A. Fisher, is just kind of an exercise in, like, like, he's just a sweetheart. So it was fun to do that in historical research because largely
you don't get many of those moments with.
No, I don't think you do. And actually, and Lloyd Morgan, you get a lot of those. He was also a big sweetheart. So anyway, so it's just reading these letters between the two, and there's some really deep philosophy, but most of it is just like them geeking out over plants and like talking about how screwed up American politics are around the Civil War, and talking about how tired they are. And I was like, this is relatable content right now. So anyway, the last thing I'll say is, so I don't know, I think maybe my answer is just Darwin is very, very, very philosophically rich, right? And not just the theory of evolution is philosophically rich because it is, but also his work is, has had a lot of foresight and identified a lot of the problems that we're going to think about for the next 200 years. So partially just going back to Darwin is just, again, that like the what are we arguing about project of history. A lot of that has a terminus in Darwin, right? The what are we arguing about? Darwin's very well aware of what those sort of like foundational issues are.
Yeah, that's great. And you said something earlier on which I think is really interesting, about this is what we teach with Darwin's arguments against, this is the Darwinian case against special creation. But when you actually look at Darwin, that's not necessarily what convinced him. He's convinced by certain things, but nowadays we kind of have these arguments that we trot out every time we teach these introductory courses. And it's something that kind of I kind of come up against when teaching courses as well. I'm teaching on a course we have here at Leeds called Darwin, Germs and the Bomb. And the first third of the course is about Darwin, and we were talking about Darwin's finches in a recent in a recent seminar discussion. And yeah, you get exactly this situation where perhaps in biology classes we're still told, Darwin saw these finches in the Galapagos Islands and their beaks were kind of different on each island, and he saw, the veil fell from his eyes and he saw the truth, when in actual fact he didn't. He didn't even know they were all finches, and he collected them haphazardly, didn't label them by island, and it wasn't until much later that he realized the true, or what we consider to be the true story. And yeah, it just makes me think about the kind of function of myths almost when we're talking about figures like Darwin. He's so mythologized that there seems to be an endless amount of historical work which needs to be done in kind of almost myth busting, which is kind of a romantic idea of what the historian is doing. Like, we're myth busters, and that's potentially one way of getting students to get really excited about the history of science. Is like, everything you've ever known is a myth, and if you come and study in our department, you'll be able to show why. But I just wonder if that's
it's also a little bit upsetting, right? Where like, so you can like, right. I mean, so I think here's the philosopher's beef with the historian often, right? Is this like myth busting, right? Where he didn't actually take the finches that wasn't actually what convinced him or whatever. And then you're just left with like but what did, right? Like clearly he got to all the views, like he did it. He got to the end. And so I think sometimes the philosopher just wants to be like, just give us a concise, like stop busting all the myths. We're not going to have anything left. And so I agree, like so I think that's the tension, right? Between, the fundamental tension between maybe history as a particularist, often discipline, and a philosophy as an extremely abstract one, right? Is both of them are missing what the other one has to offer, and I think that interplay is why like HBS is so great. So yeah, I think again, so something with students, they want to say, well, story, we can bust the myth that it's so simple as what everyone else is learning. But then I think they also want to know, like, well, was it magic, right? Like in all of the details, what were the actual, right? What was the thought process? What actually led him to believe these things? And I think there's some really interesting, cool work, to be done, like what Nancy Nersessian does and others to try to sort of give sort of a cognitive analysis of historical figures and how they actually got to where they're going to get.
Caz, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, so this is kind of related and potentially more related to the people you just mentioned, but a lot of my work is related to the idea of tacit knowledge. So people doing things without necessarily even knowing to be able to verbalize what it is they're doing. And I was wondering how much you came into contact with that while you were doing this, in terms of, well, they're using Hume, but they're not explicitly saying they're using Hume or similar things, and how you dealt with it.
That's really cool, because I think as a philosopher, I'm always really wary of reading in, right? Like, when does someone have tacit knowledge, and when do you just want to, when is that a convenient story for us to tell, right? Because if it's tacit knowledge positing that they had it, seems almost unfalsified. I don't know. So I agree, and I think that, this is partially in response to Alex's point. Darwin probably came to his realization about evolution not in a neat, stepwise way where he was making logical deductions from explicit beliefs. Like creativity and inference and stuff like that is all very nebulous and tacit, and so there's probably not actually going to be a good rational reconstruction of how he got from A to B. And so, again, Alan Orr, who I taught with, often said, like, if you talk to a good experimentalist, what they have is like horse sense, or like the sense like a good mechanic knows how to fix your car in this kind of intuitive way, rather than getting these like explicit deductive rules for what they're doing. They just have a sense of what's going to work. And that's oftentimes tacit knowledge or embodied knowledge or something like that that's not really capturable from the philosophy, like looking backwards. So I think, there might be kind of two kinds of tacit knowledge you have to worry about. One is something that's kind of like embodied and not even made explicit and propositional, something, that hunch you have, that sense you have. And another might just be like, what is your intellectual background or milieu? What concepts are you using to structure the world that maybe you're not aware of? And so, sorry, I have to leave in a minute. So I should just say, yeah, I think both of those are difficult, and I think something that historians better equipped to deal with than the philosopher, who oftentimes just deals with explicit representational kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I'll just finish this section then by saying, that it feels almost, when you come in towards the end of your PhD, you feel like you've picked up a lot of tacit knowledge as well on both how your institution works, but how also academia and research works. And you think, I'm able to read something or do something, and I know kind of what to do next. I know where to look, but you can't really, it would be difficult to kind of pass that on in a verbalized way. And so that's to say, kind of for those starting out, you'll get there.
Gosh, I understand the words.
but don't ask the people who've done it, because they won't be able to tell you.
Yeah, that's right. Just do it. Just model it. It was lovely chatting with you. I have to run to a meeting. I will. Thanks for moderating, hosting, and I'll see you on Wednesday.
Really, very much appreciated. And yeah, we're all very much looking forward to your seminar on Wednesday. So yeah, thanks a lot, Hayley. And yeah, you get off to the meeting.
All right, nice to meet you, Kaz and Dan and Alex and everybody. All right,
cheers.
Bye.
Bye.